Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're tackling something I think secretly affects all of us. How those sneaky, unrealistic expectations can really mess with our happiness. We're diving deep into a podcast episode. It's called 037: The Happiness Trap. How unrealistic expectations and goals can make us less happy. You know that feeling, right? Like, I'll be happy when I finally get that promotion, lose 10 pounds, travel the world. It's a trap.
It is so common to fall into that thinking, but the reality is, constantly chasing that future happiness, it often keeps us from enjoying the present moment.
Exactly. So we're on a mission here to help you understand the psychology behind this whole unrealistic expectations thing, why it's so prevalent, and most importantly, how to set goals that actually lead to fulfillment, not frustration.
And the foundation of this is understanding that while goal setting is inherently positive, it gives us direction and motivation, the problems start when those goals become detached from reality.
Right, like expecting to become fluent in a new language in a month, or thinking we can just achieve like a super toned physique overnight. The podcast episode used those examples, and I think they illustrate perfectly how easy it is to set ourselves up for disappointment.
It's like we're bombarded with these quick fix narratives in our culture, but real, lasting change, it takes time and consistent effort. And when we fall short of those unrealistic expectations, that's when things can really spiral.
Okay, so explain that spiral to me. What happens when we repeatedly miss the mark on these impossible goals?
What's fascinating is that instead of adjusting our expectations to be more realistic, we often double down and set even higher standards. It becomes this vicious cycle of setting ourselves up for failure and then feeling worse when we inevitably don't meet those self-imposed deadlines.
So it's not just about not reaching a specific goal, it's about the cumulative impact on our mindset, well-being.
Precisely. The podcast episode highlighted 4 major ways that this affects us psychologically. First, it leads to increased stress and anxiety because we're constantly under pressure to achieve the unattainable. It's like carrying around a heavy weight of expectation. That never lets up. And I imagine that constant pressure also leads to the second impact they mentioned, which is feeling inadequate.
Exactly. When we repeatedly fall short of those unrealistic expectations, it's easy to internalize those failures and start to feel like we're not good enough, capable enough, or worthy enough.
And this is what really gets me. We get so fixated on that massive, often unattainable end goal that we forget to appreciate the progress we're making along the way.
That's the third impact, the inability to enjoy the journey. And celebrate those smaller wins. We're so focused on the destination that we miss the beauty of the scenery along the way.
Which then feeds into the fourth impact, perpetual discontentment, that feeling of I'll be happy when. That keeps us stuck in a cycle of striving and never truly arriving. And all of this begs the question, why do we do this to ourselves? Why are we so prone to setting these unrealistic expectations that ultimately make us unhappy?
Right. It seems almost counterintuitive to set ourselves up for failure like that.
Well, a podcast episode identifies 3 main culprits, and I think we can all relate to them on some level. First, there's the immense pressure of social comparison. We're constantly bombarded with images of, perfect lives and achievements on social media and advertising and even in casual conversations.
It's like everyone else is living their best life 24/7, which creates this unspoken pressure to keep up.
Exactly. We start to compare ourselves to these often unrealistic portrayals and feel like we need to achieve everything faster and better than everyone else, which fuels that drive to set unrealistic expectations.
And it's not just external pressure, right? Sometimes that inner critic, that voice of perfectionism, can be just as relentless.
Absolutely. That inner drive for perfection can be a major contributor to unrealistic expectations. We set impossibly high standards for ourselves, believing that anything less than perfect is simply not good enough.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. And the problem with perfectionism is that even when you achieve something, the goalposts just seem to move further away.
It's a never-ending cycle of striving for an ideal that ultimately doesn't exist. And what's interesting is that the podcast episode also points out that sometimes unrealistic expectations are a way of masking a deeper fear, the fear of failure or rejection.
So we set these impossibly high goals as a way to protect ourselves. Because if we never even try, we can't really fail, right?
Exactly. It's like creating a safety net of unattainable standards so that we never have to face the vulnerability of putting ourselves out there and potentially falling short. But here's the catch. This strategy usually backfires.
Because by setting those unrealistic goals, we're almost guaranteeing some level of failure, which then just reinforces the fear we were trying to avoid in the first place.
Precisely. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of disappointment. But the good news is that there's a way to break free from this trap. And it starts with shifting our focus to setting realistic, achievable goals.
Okay, that makes sense in theory. But how do we actually put this into practice? It's one thing to say, set realistic goals, but it's another thing to actually figure out what that looks like in our own lives.
You're absolutely right. And that's where the practical advice from the podcast episode comes in. The first step is to break down those big, overwhelming goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of trying to achieve everything at once, we create a series of mini milestones along the way.
Exactly. It's like climbing a mountain. You wouldn't try to reach the summit in one giant leap, would you? You'd break it down into smaller ascents, focusing on reaching each base camp before moving on to the next.
That's a great analogy, and I can see how breaking down a goal into smaller steps would make it feel less daunting and more achievable.
Exactly. And each small win builds momentum and boosts our confidence, helping us stay motivated along the way. And once you have those smaller steps laid out, the next tip from the podcast is to ensure those goals are SMART goals.
Now, I've heard of SMART goals before, but remind me what that acronym stands for.
SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. It's a really helpful framework for ensuring that our goals are well-defined and, most importantly, realistic.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that would be useful. It takes the ambiguity out of goal setting, right?
Precisely. Instead of a vague goal like be healthier, a SMART goal would be something like exercise for 30 minutes 3 times a week. That's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant to your overall health, and it has a clear time frame.
That makes so much more sense. It's like we're giving ourselves a roadmap to success instead of just wandering aimlessly, hoping to stumble upon it.
Exactly. But setting the right goals is only part of the equation. The podcast also emphasizes the importance of shifting our mindset around the whole process. Instead of just focusing on the outcome, we need to learn to enjoy the journey itself.
So it's about finding fulfillment in the process of working towards our goals, not just waiting for that moment of achievement at the end.
Precisely. It's about celebrating the effort we're putting in, the lessons we're learning along the way, and the small victories that add up to big successes. And that shift in mindset can make a huge difference in our overall happiness and well-being.
Because we're no longer delaying our gratification, right?
Yeah.
We're allowing ourselves to experience joy in the present moment, even if we haven't reached that ultimate goal yet.
Exactly. And this ties in beautifully with the next piece of advice from the podcast, which is to practice self-compassion. We're all human, we all make mistakes, and we're all going to fall short of our goals sometimes. But that doesn't mean we're failures.
I think this is where a lot of us struggle. We set these high expectations and then beat ourselves up when we don't meet them perfectly.
It's so easy to be our own worst critics. But that's why self-compassion is so crucial. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a friend who is struggling.
That's a great reminder. We need to be more forgiving of ourselves and recognize that setbacks are a normal part of the learning process, not a sign of weakness or inadequacy.
Exactly. And finally, the podcast episode emphasizes the importance of regularly reevaluating our goals. Life is constantly changing, and what might have been a meaningful goal a year ago might not be relevant or achievable today.
That makes sense. We need to be flexible and adapt our goals as our priorities and circumstances evolve. So it's not about setting them in stone. It's about checking in with ourselves and making sure our goals are still aligned with our values and what we want to achieve in life.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot between striving for growth and honoring our own limitations and changing needs.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the pitfalls of unrealistic expectations, the reasons we fall into this trap, and most importantly, some concrete strategies for setting more realistic and fulfilling goals. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. If we know that clinging to unrealistic expectations can lead to unhappiness, could there be a case for, like, setting no expectations at all? It seems counterintuitive, but maybe releasing expectations in some areas of life might actually open the door to more peace and contentment.
That's a really interesting question, and I think it gets at the heart of finding a balance between striving for growth and accepting things as they are. It's like embracing a more go-with-the-flow mindset, where we're less attached to specific outcomes and more focused on the present moment.
It's almost like giving ourselves permission to simply be, rather than constantly pushing. To become, could that be a secret ingredient in the recipe for happiness?
It's certainly worth exploring. By releasing expectations, we might free ourselves up to experience unexpected joys and opportunities. that we would have otherwise missed if we were too fixated on a specific outcome.
It's definitely something to think about. Okay, so to wrap things up, we've really unpacked this whole happiness trap of unrealistic expectations. We explored the negative impacts it can have on us psychologically, the reasons why we fall into this trap in the first place, and most importantly, some practical strategies for setting more realistic and fulfilling goals.
Remember, setting realistic goals isn't about settling for less in life. It's about creating a pathway to genuine happiness and growth. It's about finding joy in the journey, celebrating those small wins, and being kind to yourself along the way.
And hey, maybe even experiment with letting go of expectations entirely in certain areas of your life. You might just surprise yourself with what you discover. Until next time, keep diving deep. And remember, keep those expectations in check.